on this rainy day of September. Good evening. Welcome to Majors and Quinn, everybody. My name is Sarah, and I'm a bookseller here. I'm so pleased that you're joining us here tonight to celebrate Mark Doten's book, Whites. A few housekeeping things before we get on with the show tonight. You will hear from Mark, and then there will be time at the end of the program for audience questions. After Q&A, Mark will move to the signing counter, which is the glass display case that you pass on the way in here. You may line up there to say hello, get a signed copy of the book, or whatever other chit-chat you want to make with Mark tonight. If you do buy a book here this evening, you are not only supporting our author, but also a locally owned independent bookstore, and we cannot thank you enough. Now finally, please allow me to introduce our guest. Mark is the author of Trump Sky Alpha and The Inferno, one of Grant's 2017 Best of Young American Novelists. They are the editor of Soho Press and have taught at Princeton University and Columbia University. They live in Mexico City. Please join me in welcoming Mark Doten.
Hello. Thank you, Sarah. It's so cool to be here at Majors and Quinn, truly one of the great bookstores, a lot of bookstores, and this is really an amazing independent bookstore. And it's great to see college friends, high school friends, friend from first grade maybe? First grade! Soho Press authors, and of course the amazing great folks who are here. I feel so happy and just feel great being here with all of you tonight. That feeling great may have to end because I'm going to read a couple pages of a short story in which Elon Musk is the narrator. And this story begins right after a rocket is test launched, explodes, it's chaos and disaster. Musk employees are running everywhere, and that's where it begins. I was there that day, swept along on waves of heat and data, when I felt under my left foot, then the right, the unmistakable, yuck, feeling that I was walking on a human body. I had never walked on a human body before, but I knew that's what it was. Even in my Nike Alpha Flies with their next-gen cushioning tech, even as the launch team came shrieking past me like idiots, hair on fire, hands flailing overhead, it was, yep, that's a human body. The foot is our interface with the ground, our main point of contact with the planet we live on, and it gives us both postural control and much of our proprioceptive capacity, our feel for our own bodies as they extend into and move through space. 26 bones and 33 joints and more sensory nerves per square inch than anywhere else in the human body, along with 100 plus tendons and muscles, and that's for each foot. So double it. I wondered if anyone else was walking on a human body. But no, it was only me, I'm sure of it. I was the only one walking on a human body, and that quality of being on a body seemed to slow time or thicken it. And we were the eye of everything, the human body and myself, the serene point around which whirled 1,000 torched idiots. The human foot and its capacities had already been front of mind for me for quite some time. A thought in one sector leads to an innovation in another, which leads to another thought, which leads to an innovation in yet another sector, and so on. Which is another way of saying that everything is connected, and when I am in a flow state, I find those connections profoundly legible. And so, even as our rocket was successfully test launched, and yes, it was a great success, a rocket that blows up is often the most successful rocket because the fact of the explosion is so rich with information about the rocket and the launch procedures, and also revealing the idiots and bunglers who need to be axed. But I was also thinking about the next major event, the humanoid robots we'd be demoing on Tuesday. Robots that would require the same sort of robust, intuitive mapping that I myself was bringing to bear as I slowly walked across the body of a human female. My robots would need to feel what I was feeling, map what I was mapping, and what I was mapping was not merely the contact points between foot and body. It's as though my feet were suddenly bats or tiny dolphins casting sonar into that figure and telling me everything about the body and the person within the body. Sweatshirt and rib cage, the flesh of an almost certainly female chest, the bony knot of a hand clenching a phone, which made me laugh a little, as if your grip on your phone can save you from being trampled, as if a trampled body has any need of a phone. And beyond all of that, there was a squish and resistance so precisely anatomical that it's too yucky to describe. Ugh, blech. I'll stop there.
All right. Does everybody hear me? Perfect. Okay. So I have some questions ready for Mark to hopefully get some questions brainstormed and get you going. So first question. How did writing during this first Trump administration / peak COVID compare to what is going on right now? Do you see your book playing out in real time as a kind of harbinger of what's to come?
That's a very good question. I think, you're always behind when it comes to book publishing. Like, The Daily Show or a show like South Park, they have these incredible timelines where they can turn around in a few days a new episode, and they can be very conversant with, events of that week, of the day. And in book publishing, it's a couple years before a book can come out. This Elon Musk story, for instance, was written before Elon Musk destroyed a third of the federal government. And that is not in this story. So, I think with literature, so it isn't good at immediately capturing the news of the week. But I think what it can do is both capture in ways that maybe, late night shows can't, some of the feelings of kind of what it's like to be inside this time, the way that information flows work, the way that our own minds react to all this information and all these events that are happening around us. And yeah, so I think books can be predictive, but I think it's more, for me, it's more about capturing the mood of that moment when I'm writing. And even if you're writing a near future work of fiction, you're always really writing about the now.
Great answer. Love the South Park reference. While you write a lot about the figures that loom large in this book, like Donald Trump and Elon Musk, do you also have time to unpack whiteness in more progressive circles, like in "worst Karen ever" in quotation marks? How do you navigate each of these different versions of whiteness?
Yeah. So the title story of Whites is about a woman who was very much, a left Democrat. She founded and runs a nonprofit organization which is devoted to helping unhoused populations and to building more housing and creating accessible housing. But she's also someone who is captured on tape doing a very Karen thing where she believes that a young black man who is at one of the fancy events for the nonprofit she works at has stolen her iPad, and then that escalates into a confrontation that is caught on cell phone cameras, and she becomes the worst Karen ever. And I think the way the rhetoric and the discourse around race is very different and very polarized, you know, between left and right, and beyond that, it's you know, within different communities and within within different groups, there are very different ways of thinking and talking about race. But what I've found unites these white characters here is they all have a certain reactiveness and a need to self-justify. And as with the character in Whites, she really gets locked into this moment where she just loses it because she's not reacting proportionately to what's happening around her. And in the Elon Musk story, it's a story that's kind of a time freeze story where what is probably in real life a few seconds is like a 12-page story. And he is spiraling on the idea that this woman he is walking across might be black, and what would that mean for him, for the company, for his, you know, his various ventures, how would people see that, and he's really, really pissed off about the woke mind virus even making him think these things. But I think everyone, I think it manifests in very, very different ways. But there is just a core reactiveness that white people have around race a lot of the time, and ability to really spiral out and lose perspective.
That is a very good point. Goes into the next question. Your books have been described as satire, but as your reality becomes increasingly unbelievable, excuse me, in a sense, how do you understand your work's relationship to satire/truth? Do you think that's an accurate descriptor for your book?
You know, I think it's useful. I think, you know, it's good for people to know that the intentions behind this book are you know, they're serious, but it's also supposed to be funny. And satire handles that. It kind of gives people a place to put the book in their mind, and it's certainly better than it was called like experimental short fiction, which, you know, is not the greatest marketing category in terms of moving units. I think it's really interesting to live in the era of Trump. I mean, it's awful in a zillion ways, but it's also interesting because no Trump impersonator and no one who channels Trump in writing or Talk of the Town piece in New York, or like I do in this book and my previous book, no one can do Trump better or stranger or more fundamentally broken and weird than Trump. And it's incredible because he's always, every time he opens his mouth, there's like, he has some new way of being broken and weird. And that's something that I think is remarkable and quite different from any other politician I can think of, you know, that, you know, on the scene in my lifetime. So that's something that satire can't do, is capture Trump. So again, it's the question becomes, well, what does fiction allow us to do that other media don't? And again, I think part of it is allowing us to explore some of these mental spaces, some of these types of thought spirals that living in this era provoke in us.
Personally, I think it helps. Satire kind of helps with, like, instead of crying, you can laugh at what's happening. try to look at some funny points, I guess.
But do you find yourself laughing more at pointed political satire, or at like a funny joke that shows up on your Instagram scroll?
So, okay, I don't know about that because I just deleted my Instagram last night because it's getting sad, everybody. It's getting sad. So, I think right now, I think it's an imperative time to create art. and to be really authentic right now and be transparent with the truth.
Yeah, sounds good.
So, yeah. Segue into this next question. Many authors choose to log off to write their books, but it seems like you logged in and ripped from the headlines and tweets. How did this affect your writing process? What kind of immersion did you do in order to ventriloquize these voices?
Well, I did spend a great deal of time on Twitter, on now X, on 4chan, on just various political sites, and I find these, online kerfuffles and pile-ons really interesting. There's something and obviously lots of people do, which is why, people becoming, the main character of the internet for a day is so fascinating. When someone screws up and faces the fury of the mob. So I think something, and again, like things that fiction can do, I think fiction is really good at capturing data flows and capturing kind of in a impressionistic kind of, or not impressionistic, but in a fragmented way, what it felt like in 2017 to be on the internet. And I'm sorry, I think I've lost the start of that question.
No,
Oh.
yeah, I mean, how can you be a voice for all these characters?
Okay, yeah. But I love that stuff, and I love the challenge of putting the feel of the internet and what it does into fiction. I'm a huge fan of the political novels of Joan Didion. She always, in all of her political novels, would include the characters were always confronted with mass quantities of information, for instance, related to the Iran-Contra affair and, U.S. involvement in foreign wars, and these are all situations in which vast amounts of data have to be represented somehow on the page, and I think that's something that fiction has been very good at. From Kafka, of course, we run against the massiveness of the law, the archive, the bureaucracy. Melville, in his own way, was dealing with the huge amount of scientific literature that was starting to just grow at these incredible rates, incredible for the mid-19th century. So, for 200 years we've been, or maybe since the beginning of the novel, people have been using the novel to deal with the fact that we are overwhelmed with information. And yeah, that's something I really like playing with.
Some good authors that were mentioned there, everybody.
Yeah, check them out.
Yeah.
There are actually maybe even one or two of them.
Did you come up with the idea for the short story collection first, or did you discover the through line of whiteness as an identity as you were writing?
Yeah, that came pretty early. I had written a couple stories, and there's one about a gay incel would-be mass shooter that I wrote early on. That was one where I had to think about white supremacy and how that is represented on the page, and how to have how to create a character like that in I'm not sure what the word is for it, but in an ethical way. Like how does a would-be mass shooter not become who's a narrator, not become a seductive kind of character, or one like this. But anyhow, after I'd written that story and a couple others that were located in the first Trump administration, I did have this feeling, hey, this is there's a lot of stuff about race, and I mean, like a thematic explicit preoccupation with race, and maybe I'm just going to write this entirely with white people, most of whom are dealing in explicit ways with whiteness and with their own kind of points at which they're getting stuck on their racism and and just wanting to show as many different angles as I felt I was capable of on that.
It is definitely a lot of like confronting a lot of like microaggressions, especially in like the older generations, that's for sure. You use many real public figures in your writing from the perspective of Elon Musk and even Elon, and writing tweets from Donald Trump and some real journalists in your Twitter story. It's German for the Trump, the. How do you write into who you perceive these people to be while also building an individual character?
Yeah, I mean that's a really fun problem. There's somewhere I really want to channel the voice of the character, the Trump story in this collection, and even though I said like no one's as good at Trump as Trump, and that's very true, it's still written in a kind of a Trumpy, attempting to channel actual Trump. The Elon Musk story is not attempting to channel his sort of the cadences of his speech or his sentences, though it does kind of get at some of his, hopefully, his just obnoxiousness. But it's very, I feel, fiction is something that gives you have a lot of liberty to pursue real world characters, depictions from different angles and different levels of realism, and I'm interested in some that are very close to the actual, the real person, and some that are really distorted and maybe kind of work differently against the actual real figure. I'm saying real because of course we're all living in a simulation.
I like to say that there's like absolutely no rules right now, so I'm simulation right now. What was the first story you wrote for this collection? The last. And is it difficult to know when a story collection is complete, when it's so rooted in the ever-changing contemporary world?
Yeah, I think the first one was the gay incel would-be mass shooter story. Was the first big story that I completed for this, and that kind of pointed me in some directions in terms of how narrative can work. It's there's a lot of these are just monologues, and they're often ones that are kind of that have a fragmentary sense of just very one line and then disjunct next line, new paragraph, disjunct, which allows you to both do stuff with time and collapse or expand time, and also suggest things about these people's mental states. And then the last one, I really had a hard time finishing up both White's, the title story about the worst Karen ever, and another story in it called Jumpman. And I think, during the time I was writing this book, my mother was very ill. She had cancer. She had a kind of a disastrous brain biopsy that left her with some severe cognitive and physical deficits. And so during the writing of this book, there's also a lot, me and my brother and sister were taking care of doing a lot of care stuff for my mother, who then eventually passed away. And I think because there is a dying mother character in both of those stories, who is in some ways it draws on my mother and my relationship with my mother. I think they're both, they're really big, long stories, and they're pretty ambitious in terms of how many characters and pieces they have, but I think it's really hard to let those go in a way, because that's such a, it's a challenging thing to include in your writing, and wanting to get that emotion and some feeling of who my mother was and what the experience of losing her was like into these stories, even though the characters are not me and they're not my mother. Yeah, that was interesting. I think I had a really hard time letting go of those two stories.
I'm sorry for the loss, man. Online subcultures often have their own vocabularies. What do you think the language in these spaces tells us about their ethos?
I don't know. I mean, there's certainly something to be said for, various parts of the internet have different ways of speaking. I think, there's I mean, it's such a big question, and there's so many, like, answers to it. But it's really fun, I think, as a writer to play with the ways in which, for instance, in the title story in Whites, the way in which the people talk, like the white people talk around stuff or past stuff without addressing it. Like, this woman is very committed to, like, she's very committed to social justice and progressive causes, and yet she has this incredible ways of just talking around and justifying all of her behavior. And so I think that's one kind of thing that's interesting. I mean, the gay incel would-be mass shooter, white supremacist character was, it was interesting to look at kind of that, some parts of the internet and incel culture, because yeah, they have their own vocabulary and ways of speaking and ways of seeing things. And, I mean, we can see that anywhere. I mean, just like a more mainstream site like Reddit, all these subreddits have different ways of speaking, different language, and I think that's, it's an interesting time to be a writer from that perspective, just because we have so much access to so many different ways of speaking.
Totally true. What do you want your audience to take away from from Whites? Sorry.
I don't know. I tend to write with thinking of just pushing, what do I find interesting in terms of prose, in terms of language, how sentences move against one another, and how, how ideas can do the same, can sort of undercut and contradict and deepen and so on. In terms of specifically what I want people to take away, I don't think that my work is really useful in that way. I think there's some literature that is, and some very great literature that is. But I don't know, I guess it's the experience of having read something that's did something to their brain, and also, that maybe there's a certain amount of, like, feeling that you'll see yourself in some of these characters. Or see yourself in some of the experiences that are in the book. But I mean, for instance, I don't think there's like, that you can really speak of like a unitary reader or like a unitary white reader, but I do think, it's probably somewhat different reading this book as a white person and reading it as someone who is not white.
All right, everybody. Do we have some questions for Mark? I'm just gonna come this way. So.
Hey, just curious, like growing up in Minnesota, like if that shaped any of the things you brought into or felt. I mean, I've lots of experiences since then too, but you're in Minnesota, so.
Yeah, I mean that was, and there are multiple stories in here set in Minnesota, but yeah, I think Heather and I and Alex Alex and Nick went to Hastings High School, 93 to 97, and that was a very interesting time. I think it was a school that was vastly majority white, very racist. I mean, there was a huge amount of like racist discourse, racist jokes. There were some acts of violence that were really terrible while we were there. There were explicitly like white people like beating up, like for instance, a black immigrant from Africa who was at a school from, someone who had immigrated recently. So I think that really centers a lot, and maybe having seen that, and also being gay, like seeing that kind of just the level of homophobia and what it kind of does to like my own psyche is another thing that the book tangles a lot with queerness too, and sometimes queerness and the intersection of race and queerness. It certainly sets one up for definitely not believing in a world that's like colorblind or anything like that, because that stuff was crazy. And I think, and I think even, I think high schools and middle schools are still like, from what I've heard, like pretty bad. Like on the surface, they're pretty good. There's been lots of anti-bullying. There's like, kind of things are more locked down in school, but then what happens online, and everyone's online, is some of the ugliest stuff you can imagine. So, yeah. But yeah, big, inform things in a big way.
Since we're talking about location, I know you're based in Mexico City now, and I wonder what it's like to be maybe writing about the U.S. now, living in Mexico City, and maybe witnessing it sort of from the outside a little bit more versus when you were based in the U.S. and if that has changed the way you write or think about what's going on here.
Yeah, I think the distance is useful. It's also psychologically just nice to have a little bit of distance, but it's I think that distance can be nice, can be useful, and then also I'm starting to write stories set in Mexico, and Mexico City is one of them in this book. But it's certain, like, what Trump is doing is so unavoidable that, like, all the, there's not really an outside to it for, I mean, you would have to be very rigorous about not reading the news, or, some, you might call it kind of be head in the sand. I don't know, I mean, I don't know how much media is the right amount to consume, but Trump is definitely doing his best to, live rent free in everybody's brain, no matter what part of the world you're living in.
Since you brought it up, and living in he's living in our brains, but what was it like? How did you sort of protect your own psyche inhabiting these characters as you were writing them?
I do not feel, as Jared Leto does, that playing the Joker made him kind of become the Joker in a way. I don't experience that as a problem. For me, it's really just finding ways to put words next to each other in a way that is interesting and does things that I want it to do, if that makes sense. Like, it can be funny, and it is, like, they do force you to go to some kind of dark places in terms of, you know, humor, but I also think that, like, we all go to dark places in our brain, we just don't necessarily put it on paper, or, you know, in Trump's case, you know, say it in a news conference or on a, I'm forgetting what his social media, on a Truth Social post. But yeah, I think that's interesting and fun. Like, the hard part was writing the, like, more characters who are maybe closer to my own experience, like the worst Karen ever, or the protagonist of love stories that are closer to my experience.
Did you ever hear from the administration or Trump or get under his skin? And if not, was it disappointing, or was it a relief?
No, I have not. And it's very nice that I've never, like, psychologically, it's very nice that I've never been at the center of any sort of, like, right-wing online pile-on. But, you know, I think it would be better for the books sales-wise. But that also relies on these people, like, you know, these people don't read experimental short stories from independent publishers. These people don't read, you know? These people may not know how to. Certainly the president doesn't. So yeah, if it happened, that'd be interesting, probably unpleasant in some ways and good in other ways. Safer? To not or to have that?
It's safer to not be known. It's safer to not be recognized.
Of course, you know, I assume they have a file on me this big. Yes.
Otherwise,
One last question, but it has to be really good. It has to be the best question.
yes, I think
No
just
pressure.
yes.
It is the,
Yes.
should we all get nervous if Orange Julius is gifted a dirigible by another country that's golden?
This is a reference to my previous book, Trump's Guy Alpha. And yes, we definitely should. That one, the very early in the novel, the world, most of the world blows up in a big, you know, nuclear to-do, and yeah, and that's that book, and this one is sort of, okay, well, what if everything doesn't blow up, but things blow up in a smaller, more human scale way that they currently are.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for answering our questions and having this conversation with us tonight. Round of applause, everybody.
Okay, I need to take a picture of the audience so I can, like, prove to people.
Quick photo op, real quick. Just look really for your Thursday best.
Can you take a picture of me up here too?
I can take a picture of it. I won't.
Okay, it's starting. This is a iPhone 13, so got the lightning plug. So So good. Thank you, Minneapolis!
Perfect. Perfect. We'll meet everybody at the class display case.
Yeah.
Heather, you're a grade. You're a grade above us, right?
Yeah. I'm just in terms of year, not anything else. That's it's not like
That'll, I think going this way will be easier.